There I am. Like this? There you go. I'm sorry, but that was the keynote presentation, very light font. So I'm happy that your computer changed the changed the font up there. You'd think after all this time I would get it right, but human, still learning. Also, if there's anyone who missed out on the paper that I presented last time, I have a couple of hard copies here that were left over if you want to pick up a copy. So, 3 more minutes. Okay, good to go? All right. Well, thank you everyone again for being here this afternoon. I hope that so far you've been having a blessed and peaceful Sabbath with good fellowship, good food, good message as you worship together this morning and as we're going to continue to do so this afternoon. So the song that you just heard me playing, we're going to actually sing that now, and I'm glad a few of you know it. This is going to be our prayer for this afternoon. Yeah, sorry about that. So the chorus that we just sang is inspired from Romans 12, verse 1. I'm going to flesh this out a little bit more later on in today's workshop. So just a quick recap from the last workshop. I understand all of you were here then, and that's great. So we talked about the law of worship, we looked at the biblical model, and the purpose of worship has been misinterpreted, misrepresented, and even lost in some congregations. We talked about it being displaced, worship being displaced, anchored on means, forms, and symbols instead. We talked about the worship service, the collective gathering. In some churches exists for the satisfaction and entertainment of those who gathered there. I mentioned that in some churches there is an acute awareness of a weak faith foundation and a need for a return to an intimate knowledge and relationship of and with God. And then I shared with you an example from Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 to 11, the account of Jesus in the desert for 40 days where the devil came and tempted him. Worship is a matter of the mind and the heart, a fluid and allegiance. It's not bound by time or space or a room. It is a fluid state, or should be a fluid state. Worship is eternal. And then at the end, I gave 5 recommendations for more effective worship experiences. The first, for those of you especially who prepare for the worship service each week, if you want a little bit more about that or to revise that, you can either watch the video or you can grab a copy of the last presentation. So when I was about 12 years old, I was a huge fan, or still am, of Elvis Presley. Now, my fanship was an all-encompassing fanship. I wasn't just a fan of Elvis, I wanted to be Elvis. But I didn't just want to be Elvis, I wanted to be the girls who hung around Elvis. I didn't know what a groupie was back then. I just liked the way they looked, I loved their long nails, I loved everything about them. And then I not only wanted to be like the girls who hung around him, I wanted to play like his piano players, and I vowed that one day I would play like his piano players. And that part of it, do you recognize this? Anybody recognize that intro? Reach out to Jesus. Yeah. And so on. Anyway, when I was supposed to be practicing my piano exam pieces, that's what I was doing. I was transcribing, I was running to the piano and playing everything and anything that I shouldn't have been. So I was such a big fan that I not only listened to the music, but I copied everything. I copied Elvis's mannerisms, so much so that to this day, I kid you not, don't go looking for it, but there is still a muscle memory that I have that I copied back when I was 12 years old that I still sometimes do subconsciously. And nothing to do with dancing, so don't expect me to break out into any kind of dance. So, huge fan. I got to meet both of them when I was in Las Vegas a few years ago. But the reason I'm sharing this with you is because for quite a number of years, I beheld the man and his music so much so that it consumed everything that I did. And while I didn't turn into Elvis, I did end up learning to play like some of his piano players. I did end up copying his mannerisms. I did end up dressing like his entourage. So we become what we behold. And this afternoon, we are going to be having a look at, well, last time when we met, we talked about why we worship and what worship is. This afternoon, we're going to look at how we worship. So we call these, sometimes they're called the practices of worship, sometimes they're called the means of worship. Whatever we call them, they are either internal or external things that we do in order to worship God, or anything for that matter. So how do we behold? I didn't just stare at Elvis on TV and just watch him do his thing. I would go and practice and repeat those mannerisms, the notes, would transcribe the music over and over and over again in order to become what I wanted to become. And like I mentioned earlier, the prayer that we prayed earlier, based on Romans 12, verse 1 says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice." What does that mean? To surrender your entire being to God. Holy and pleasing to God. How do we make ourselves holy? By being healed and transformed into the likeness of God. This is your true and proper worship, the verse says. The most reasonable, logical, and intelligent worship we can possibly offer by offering ourselves. The next verse says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world." What are the patterns of this world? Give me some. What's it talking about there? Don't conform. Selfishness, love it. That's the first one I had on my list. Well, out of that stems a lot of other things, doesn't it? Selfishness, fear. But yes, go on. Yes, yeah. Which stems from selfishness, doesn't it? Yeah, me first. Yeah, not other-centered love, but me at the top. "But be transformed by the renewing of your mind," the verse continues. When we renew our mind, then we will value God's principles, practice his methods, discern his will, his good, pleasing, and perfect will for our lives. So the practices, internal and external, are expressions of worship. We could be sitting very quietly and just meditating in our mind without showing any outward signs that we are worshipping. That is still worship. And of course, external expressions of worship are what we worship through. And we do that when we gather together as a collective. These can include prayer, giving of our time, of our financial surpluses, the spoken word, Bible study, singing and instrumental music making, and listening to music, fellowship, outreach, and this list can go on. So worship is not about rules, particular rules, or about artifact. In 1 Samuel 4, there is an account of Israel going to war against the Philistines. And in that particular battle, initially 4,000 men were lost. And when some of them returned to camp, the Israelite elders said, and this is in verse 3 of chapter 4, "For what reason hath the Lord smitten us today?" So they were blaming God for their loss before the Philistines. After that, they said, "Let us fetch the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of Shiloh," because that's where the ark was at the time. "Let's bring it to us so that when it comes to us, it may save us." Does anybody know what happened after that? Long story short, they went out to battle again and they lost 30,000 men. Yeah. They blamed God. They thought the artifact, the ark, was going to save them, and they ended up losing many more soldiers that day. And so there is a fear that sometimes when we put those things before God, that our worship has no effect. So when we come together to worship, what is the purpose of our coming together for worship? In Hebrews 10:25, it says, "Let us not forsake the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some." So what that means is some have stopped doing this. When I was in the States, I've been to the States a few times, but on this particular occasion, my first trip there a few years ago, I noticed the absence of the men in the church. The women folk were there, the children were there, but husbands, partners, sons were obviously absent from that congregation. The verse goes on to say, "But let us exhort." To exhort means to encourage one another, especially as you see the day approaching. And that refers to the day of our deliverance. There are other verses. If you want to take these down, Colossians 3:16 is another one, which tells us when we gather together, we should fill our minds with truth, the will of God, teaching and admonishing. Admonishing means gently reproving or warning or directing someone's mind to something which needs attention. In all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs with thankfulness in your heart. And there are many verses, I'm just sharing a couple with you this afternoon. 1 Corinthians 14:26, it says, "What then, brothers, when you come together, each one has a hymn, a song which has blessed them, a lesson, a revelation, something which helps others understand a concept, a tongue or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up." There are your purposes of meeting together. Of course, it's nice to fellowship with everyone. It's nice to catch up. But the purpose of us worshipping together are these. A biblical example, Acts 13:15-48. What did the apostles, what did Jesus do when they went to the synagogue on the Sabbath? In these passages, I won't read them, I'll just give you a quick summary. In these passages is the account of Paul, Barnabas, and their friends traveling to Antioch, where they went to the synagogue. Synagogue means either the place of assembly or the assembling together on the Sabbath day. I'm going to assume there was a worship leader there reading a Bible passage because it says scripture was read. And then whoever was leading out asked of those who were present, "Is there anyone here who has a message of encouragement to the people? Please share it." Paul stood up and proceeded to speak, recalling the Exodus experience, the settlement in Canaan, going through the stories of judges, kings, Jesus coming through the line of King David, and of course referring to John the Baptist. He then taught prophecy and what Jesus achieved on the cross. And then in verse 38, he applied all of this to the present time. So here is the application. They read scripture, they offered opportunity for someone to speak, and now we come to the crux, the application where he applied it to all of those who were there, explaining to the people how through Jesus they are forgiven and through trust receive the righteousness of God. And if you recall the account, many were encouraged and invited Paul and his company to speak again the following Sabbath. In verse 46, he leaves the people, and this is another important aspect of our coming together. He leaves the people to choose for themselves. He presents the message, he fleshes it out, he explains what that means to us personally, and then he says, now it's come time for you to choose. In verse 47, he reminds them that God has called them to be a shining light which spreads the gospel. And so there is the evangelism component. Pastor, you asked me last time in a question, you said, give me something, a formula of how and perhaps how to present here so that it's effective. Did I understand the question? Did I understand the question correctly? Trying to remember, yeah. And I wrote in quotation marks here, you said, give me something. I'm hoping that answers the question. But as you'll note later, there really is not one exact formula. This is more of the big picture that I'm presenting to you this afternoon. What does the spirit of prophecy say? There are a couple of quotes. I won't take time to read them to you this afternoon, but I found a couple of quotes, one from the Bible Echo back in 1887, where she says, yes, we focus too much on the structure of the service, on what happens during the service. We're so concerned about all of those things that we've forgotten about God's presence in our midst. So here are 4 questions you, as worship coordinators, pastors, music coordinators, might like to ask yourself when you are preparing for the worship service. Question 1, does the worship reveal and acknowledge God, His glory, who He is, and what He does for us? First and foremost, I think. The second question, does the worship help the congregants to identify where they are? Yes, I've heard this said many times, worship is all about God. Yes, it is. But He wants a response from us. He doesn't come into this space just expecting the praise and worship and giving glory to Him. It's a two-way street. Question 3, does this worship seek change? Are you encouraging? Are you prompting those who are present to seek change in their own lives on a personal level and as a collective, as a whole church? And lastly, does this worship encourage evangelism? Going forth, being that shining light that I mentioned before, that Paul talks about in Acts chapter 13. So, the worship service, the structure. You might be looking to get information about some exact specifics here this afternoon. I'm not going to give you that because there are a plethora of books written on this topic, and there are tens, if not hundreds, of suggestions for structure within a worship service. So there's no hard and fast rule. I am very happy to hear that Mount Cravat Church, and I haven't been here since you started doing that, but a little birdie tells me that you have put the announcements first. Is that correct? Have I understood? Yes, which is wonderful. Because, you were expecting me to say, no. So that they don't disturb or break the remainder of the time. Yeah? If possible, obviously we can't eliminate them altogether. We have to tell the folk what's what, don't we? Now the rest, and I'm sorry to tell you, this is of little or no consequence, but before you start sending me emails, it's of little or no consequence if the purpose prevails. Does that make sense? So the order is not of any consequence to our faith, to our salvation. It is the purpose that prevails, and then you can decide what best order to put things in. Planning is one thing. As you plan to guide the flock, who has time for debriefing? It's tricky, isn't it? You have the service, you forget about it. But as a worship team, I would suggest if you have the time, talk about past experiences, worship experiences, what you felt went well. And I'll repeat this again, there's no hard and fast rule or pattern. something that's going to work for everybody. That's impossible. But it's good to discuss what's working, what's not. You obviously did that when you decided that the announcement should go first. So that's just one example. All aspects of the worship service can be thematic, but they don't necessarily have to be. You don't have to have everything that's in line with the main thing, with the spoken component. Prayer. Is Keith here today? Keith suggested that perhaps rather than just talking about music, and of course I come to you as a musician, so that's why it's heavy on the music component. But Keith suggested we should talk more about other components of the worship service. Prayer, is another aspect of worship, and I'm sure there's messages and have been messages about prayer. In his book, The Worship Maze, Finding a Style to Suit Your Church, Basden suggests that this could be a 4-section pattern for your worship service. So praise, which generally I guess refers to music, but it doesn't have to. Prayer, our conversations with God. Proclamation, so proclamation of the word, the presentation of the word, and then presentation, which he refers to as the presentations of ourselves for change, submission, and outreach. Are you seeing a pattern through what I've suggested this afternoon? I hope. But if not, some food for thought. Of course, individual preparation is important. Those of you who prepare every Sabbath, being authentic, being in a relationship with God yourself is very, very important as you prepare to lead the bigger group. Careful and prayerful choice of language. I talked about this last time. Language which does not compartmentalize worship by saying, and now as we enter into the worship hour, you remember I mentioned, after singing, I heard an elder say that, now as we enter into the worship hour, or people introducing a song by saying, we're doing this song today because I like it, or because it's on my playlist, or give some deep thought into what you're going to say and how you are going to generate some meaning for the congregation through what you say. And then lastly, you who have gone to the trouble and have taken the time to prepare all of this for the worship services, are you worshipping? And I'll be honest with you, sometimes when I play piano, I am focused on everything else but worshipping. And it's really important, and I have to rein myself in many times. I'm either listening to the sound or I'm looking around the room. Or it's easy to do. All right, moving on. Any questions up to this point? Comments? Judgments? No? Okay, so music making. Vocal and instrumental music. We're just going to have a quick look at the biblical perspective, and then we're going to look at, again, our collective situation. Music is a God-given gift to created beings and not just us humans. He didn't just give us music as a vessel for worship or carrying the gospel, but he gave it to us for medicinal purposes, to accompany prophesying, and I'll talk more about that later. Many, many purposes behind the gift of music. Music was in existence before creation, as we know from the account in Job. Before creation, as we know from the creation of Lucifer, my apologies. At creation, that we know from the account in Job. It will be present at the second coming, and we will be making music through all eternity. What eye has not seen, nor ear has heard, I am looking forward to that day, to hear sounds and timbres that I have not yet heard. Even though we have these biblical principles, the Bible is not clear on everything, and so contentions around the timbres and the styles and genres of music exist in our places of worship. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But in thinking about styles of music, these are my musings. You might not agree with me, but I think God's foreknowledge enables him to have heard every sound, every timbre, every style of music that we have heard to this point and will get to hear until he comes again. Does that make sense? Yeah. So when we talk about the law of physics or the law of gravity, we didn't invent them. They were always in existence because God created them. But he gave people the insight into working out the formulas, the patterns. Same with music. We didn't invent, the combinations of the notes in our Western music or the combinations of the notes in jazz or blues or whatever. Do we not think that God heard all of those sounds before they came onto this planet? But sometimes we give people credit for inventing those, but all of those sounds, I believe, were always there. We just discovered the possibilities, and because it's God-given, there's so much more of that to be discovered. I'm looking forward to that. So in 2 Kings, talks about, long story short, talks about 3 kings going to war against the Moabites. They started traveling to where they were going and ran out of water. Things weren't going too well. They felt they were doomed, and so they asked for a prophet of God. And someone suggested they go and see Elisha. And when they came to him, Elisha called for a minstrel, a traveling musician. And when the minstrel played, the hand of the Lord came upon Elisha and he prophesied. Did the minstrel make any difference to him receiving the prophecy from God? Of course not. Of course not. But it was there as a vessel to help him to prophesy. In the books of Samuel and Chronicles, these books are filled with examples of singing, playing instruments, that went along with prophesying, worshipping, the carrying of the ark, the opening of the temple, and then in Psalms we read about music accompanying processions and other celebrations. So the Bible is filled with these examples. What the Bible doesn't mention is style. It's not specific about the style of music that we should be using for worship. There's probably a good reason for that. Now, the issues surrounding music, as I've discovered, as I've travelled around many churches, these are some of the contentions that we argue, these are some of the points that we argue over. These topics are so vast and so broad, I don't have time to cover them this afternoon. But the first one, egocentric songs. Songs that focus just on me. And I've heard this many, many times from people who generally are against contemporary music, and just a broad comment that all contemporary music is very egocentrical. To that I say, please read Jeremiah's Lamentations. He lamented for Israel as a collective, but also for himself. And I also say, in answer to this, please read the Psalms. Neither takes the focus away from God, but does also focus on the personal lament on behalf of a people, and also in a very personal way. So, to the folk who say all contemporary songs are egocentric, I would just encourage you to carefully consider the lyrics of any song, be it a hymn or a contemporary song, before you make your judgment. Have a bit of a closer look at the lyric before making a broad comment. Repetition. I've heard lots of people say the songs that repeat words over and over again are nauseating. I don't believe they bring me closer to God. A couple of things here. Those who are on milk need repetition, don't they? Our children need repetition. When the Africans were transported over to the west coast of America, 1 million of them were transported as slaves. They learned their songs with much repetition, very short choruses. There was no music written down, so they had to be taught in a, I learned a big word a couple of years ago, tralitious manner, passing on from one person to the other. But to that I also add, if repetition in songs bothers you, have a read of Revelation 4, 8 to 11, where it says, each of the 4 living creatures had 6 wings, full of eyes all around and under their wings. They worshipped without ceasing, day and night. And of course, there's no night in heaven, so this is talking about constantly, singing, repeating this constantly. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God, the Almighty. Repetition isn't bad, it just depends on what the focus is on. The argument between emotion and piety. I don't even know where to begin here. This is a huge topic, and I'll just leave it at this, and you can chat to me afterwards if you want to. The Bible is not silent on emotion. When I see Jesus peering through that little black cloud at his coming, I am not going to be standing in a, in a fixated state. Maybe I will, out of disbelief. But I think the joy that will overcome me on that day is I won't be able to control my emotions. Some people say, no, we should be pious, we should be reverent. And generally with that piety and that reverence, what do we associate that with? Being still, being expressionless. Yeah. Unfortunately, this comes, the way we express ourselves physically in our own denomination comes from our Protestant history. Our earthly history from Protestantism. We've kind of pushed back the way the Israelites expressed themselves through worship, through music. We've kind of said, no, that's not how we want to worship. We'd rather be a little bit more pious, a little bit more reverent. So, big topic. Now, emotion, it depends on the level. It depends on the type. It depends on the reason. And I can't, in all honesty, tell you if someone is worshipping based on their outward expression. That is between them and God. Number 4, simple lyrics versus deep theology. Probably similar response to repetition. Sometimes we need those simple songs, even as adults, even those who are on meat. Sometimes we need those simple songs. It's great to have songs that have deep theology, that teach us those deeper biblical truths. This is very subjective. And my only question here, my only sort of, what's the word that I'm looking for? Sort of marker, yeah, is does either represent truth? That's my first question when I consider these. It can be simple, it can be theologically deep. Does it represent truth? Popular gospel styles versus hymns. Before, let's say around the time of the Reformation, a little bit before that, we did not have a keyboard that looked like this one. The keys that you see, the black keys now that jut out of the keyboard, they were non-existent. So we have what we'll call church modes. And they were a series of 7 notes, which you might recognize as the major scale. And then, of course, you can add the 8th note. And so that was the major scale, which normally, sometimes when we teach children about major, we say, oh, it's a happy key, it's a bright key. And so the minor scales were not in existence. We're talking about 500 years ago or so. They weren't in existence. So if you wanted something to sound like it was in a minor key, you went to the next note of that first scale that I played for you, and you started on that note, and you played to the next note. So you had 7 or 8 notes in that order. Then you started on the next note. So you could still sing with melodies that sounded different, but you could only work with those seven notes. Then around the middle of the 19th century, we have what was invented called the well-tempered keyboard. And that is where the distance between, I'm getting into a bit of musical theory. I won't stay on this too long, but again, if you have any questions, please ask me. So the well-tempered keyboard was able to play the notes that had the same distance between them. We call them semitones, or in America they call them half steps. So we ended up with this scale called the chromatic scale. And so all of a sudden we needed extra notes. Now, the only reason for the black keys, if they weren't here, our keyboard would be out there somewhere. So our wingspan doesn't cover that. So in order to be able to play effectively with your 10 digits, the keyboard is made to a length that we can reach from here to here. And then, of course, some of the notes are popped up. The only reason for the 5 black keys is so we can find where we are. They used to be white. The white keys used to be black. The reason they were changed is because the line on the black keys made it difficult to know where you were. So now we have this pattern of 5 black keys divided in 2 groups of 2, 3, 2, 3. It's only for the benefit of being able to play it effectively. There's no other reason behind that. So my question to you is then, what did we sing for the other 5,500 years? What did music sound like? Harps? Yeah? There was other instrumentation? Yeah? Other scales? We really don't know. We have some records in history that we can hear and play, and musicians of today have recorded those songs, so we can sort of gauge a little bit how music sounded, but probably I'm going to guess maybe from about 400 or 500 AD. So what were they singing? How did it sound before that? We just don't know. And so when people say to me, we should only be singing hymns, which hymns? Yeah, we don't know what the hymns of the Bible sounded like. We know what the thematic material was of those hymns. We get a little bit of an idea from Scripture. But if this Western style of notation that I mentioned to you earlier has only existed for about 500 years, and then people say we should only be singing hymns, they are generally referring to the hymns that were penned during the time of Martin Luther. Anyway, I'll move on because... Yeah, I could talk for days on this. And of course, the last one, instrumentation, again, a huge topic. Because in Bible times, we have instruments used for worship, to soothe. As we know, Saul was soothed by the playing of David's harp. We have instruments used for vile, pagan worship. Many denominations use those verses to say we shouldn't use any instruments in church because they are associated with pagan worship. We as a denomination, we revere the organ we revere the organ above any other instruments only because of the Reformation. If you recall, Martin Luther, he didn't want to leave his church. He just wanted to reform it. And so many things that the church fathers, declared, to be holy, some of our traditions come from that. And that's why we revere the organ sometimes above all other instruments. But there was contention surrounding that as well, because the organ was used as the background music in the Colosseums when the Christians were being torn apart by vicious animals. And so even the church was reluctant to bring the organ in the first place. But the reason they did, they found that it was an instrument which could sustain the notes, which matched the singing of the time, and so the organ would double up on the singing in sort of music that was non-metrical. There wasn't a time signature or a definitive beat, and so they found the organ matched that really well. There was reluctance when the piano was first brought into the church. Why? It was too percussive. We don't bring percussion instruments into church, and that's why people were reluctant to bring in the piano. Whereas the African American Christian community loved the piano, and that's where the gospel piano style comes from, and I won't share that with you this afternoon because that's another topic as well. Okay, let's move on. I don't want to put anybody to sleep, but so how are we going with time? All right. So music making in our worship service. Let's now bring that all into today. The purpose must prevail. The biblical purpose of using music in church must prevail, and we've already covered that. I can't remember the name of the book, but I was reading a book about the history of the contemporary song. And there is about a page and a half in there written about the Jesus movement, and then what happened after that, and when Christian music started being commercially produced. And there is a sentence in there that says that initially contemporary and rock-style gospel music was not meant for the church. It was meant for youth gatherings outside of the church, conferences and youth rallies and things like that. I kind of think about that and go, okay, so we could use that music outside of the church, but we don't bring it into the church. Do you know what that said to me? It's only the building that matters. It's only the venue that matters. If we can worship God out there through this music, but we don't bring it into the church. It kind of didn't sit right with me, but anyway, you can consider that for yourself. So, and we've tried, as I mentioned in the last presentation, we've tried to bring that contemporary music into the church, but we've tried to copy the bands who have made it their occupation, their life's journey to compose music, to make money from it, and often it becomes a huge failure when we try to do that music the same way that they present it. And so I'm suggesting to you this afternoon to consider, if you like a song, if it's meaningful to your presentation, consider doing a cover of the song. Hymns lend themselves to so many different styles. As you know, your hymnal is written in 4-part vocal style, right? If you're not sure what that means. So there's the soprano part, the alto part, the tenor part, the bass part. That doesn't denote any kind of style. I can play What a Friend in Mozart style. Yeah? I can play it in a jazz style. Sorry, not very well. I can play it in a blues style. Same song. Lots and lots of different styles. So hymns lend themselves to lots of different styles. So I'm saying if we can reinterpret a song, a hymn, into another style, why can't we take a contemporary song and simplify it for the congregation? And that's simply what a cover is. We don't need to copy the bands who initially present these songs, the original recording. We can do a cover of contemporary songs just like we do with hymns. Yeah. If you want to know how to do that, maybe ask me later. Okay, how to simplify some of the contemporary songs. Consider the message in the song. not based on your personal preference or personal taste, but consider the message in the song. And I know I sound like a broken record, but how does this song generate meaning for either the message that will be spoken or for the congregation? What does it mean? Why are we singing this? Consider your demographic. This is really important. When you watch Hillsong and you watch Bethel and you watch Elevation worship, do you notice that the demographic is narrowed? Yeah? You don't see a lot of grey-haired people there. You don't see any children there. The demographic is generally of a particular age group. And they know the songs. They listen to them before they come to church, and they know them and they sing them without needing to look up at the PowerPoint. But you need to, when thinking about music, you need to consider this demographic. We were just chatting before the presentation, Gabrielle and Kathy, about choosing the right key for a song for collective singing. And you'll note that a lot of the songs that you listen to in the contemporary song world, they're all sung by male tenors, or most of them. They're a lot sung by female vocalists as well. And so the problem with this is, the ladies have to sing up in the rafters. The gents, it's great for them. They go home going, wasn't the music great today? Because it suits their range. And the ladies are either singing up there or they're singing down here. So choosing a key that suits everybody. I don't know if you've thought about that in the hymnal, but it's the reason that a lot of our hymns are either in the key of G, in the key of A flat. Now, I admit, some of the songs in the hymnal are very high. I think. Yes, we have this hope, yes, in the key, because it goes up to that E flat on that high note. But generally, this is a general observation that most of the hymns in the hymnal are in those keys around the middle of the keyboard there, where it's singable for the majority. Again, you'll never get it perfect, but they're singable for the majority. Consider the key, consider the range, I have no objections for syncopation. Does everybody know what syncopation means? Yeah. I have no objections, but some songs are heavily, heavily syncopated, and the congregation struggles to sing them. One of the songs, Like a Rose Trampled on the Ground, what's the title of the song? Above All. Very, very difficult song for the congregation to sing. We love to sing it, but if you have a look at the music itself, it's heavily syncopated, and the accompaniment, generally when I accompany, it's just sort of like a vamp that goes, just straight. And the congregation wants to sing on the beat, and they find it very, very hard. So no issues with syncopation, but consider that when you are choosing songs. If they're heavily syncopated, the congregation will struggle. So I'm saying to you again, if the song is heavily syncopated and you do a cover of it, why can't you simplify the rhythm? Yeah? Link to the first point. No? That's it. Okay. Any questions before we do a practical exercise? Questions, comments? I've covered a lot of stuff. I probably said things that I didn't plan to say. I probably didn't say things that I planned to say, but that's how it is when sometimes you're speaking off the cuff, even though